Around 2,000 prisoners in England and Wales are being freed early today in an attempt to ease the overcrowding crisis. And the offenders, all of whom are serving sentences of less than 5 years, are being released after a mere 40% of their sentence, rather than the usual 50%. Now, this comes with reports that hundreds of victims were unaware that perpetrators of crimes against them are being freed amid warnings that the public are being put at heightened risk. And we can cross live now to GB News' national reporter Charlie Peters, who is outside HMP Wandsworth. Charlie, welcome to the show. We've seen some astonishing scenes today of prisoners coming out to be greeted by champagnes, to cannabis cigarettes, almost doing cartwheels at their early freedom. And Charlie, this sends out a terrible, terrible message to those on the receiving end of crime.
Well, Martin, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, said that this was a risky move. He conceded that as he acknowledged that the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, had given the probation service 8 weeks to prepare for this major release date. Some 1,700 prisoners being released across the country. We anticipate some 400 in London. Now, in Wandsworth today, we've seen a few dozen released. But as you say, Martin, there have been some scenes of them being received into welcoming and joyful, almost partying crowds here, popping champagne as they left the gates here at HMP Wandsworth, a prison that, by every metric, is one of the worst in the country. Some 1,500 prisoners inside, well above the population limit. It's a Victorian prison. Its cells are dirty, squalid, they're crumbling. And with all of that going on, there's a lot of concern within not only the probation services, but also charities around them, that prisoners going into Victorian-era establishments like Wandsworth aren't going to come out rehabilitated, even if they're spending 40% of their sentence and being let out early with that 8 weeks of additional preparation. There's also concern about the state of the probation service that they'll be received by, because just 2 of the 12 probation regions in England and Wales are deemed satisfactory. There's a shortage of over 2,000 probation staff. They don't even think that around only 70% of those released from prison will be in settled accommodation within 3 months. Now, earlier today, I spoke to one prisoner as he came out, some ex-convict, who said that he was delighted about the 40% early release, but the person who stood next to him coming out at the same time said he was unhappy about it. He didn't want to leave. He was concerned, like many prisoners are, about homelessness. Now, that speaks obviously towards prisoner welfare, but also concerns about victims and those who support them, because when people leaving prison are leaving such appalling conditions with overcrowding on an astronomical scale, but also drug abuse and violence inside, and then coming out into these sorts of conditions with homelessness, etc., there is concern, is there not, about people being more likely to reoffend. They expect that about a quarter of everyone who's released from prison this year will be back inside within a year. Now, that's the risk that the justice system is taking today, with a broken, frayed and really straying justice system in England and Wales, as it hits a record high number of prisoners last week at 88,521. Now, Labour will be hoping that the move they've made today, with that 8 weeks of preparation, will reduce the burden on prisons, improve the quality of service prisoners receive inside, and does not impact victims too much on the outside. Well, as you can imagine, lots of people supporting victims, especially those involved in domestic abuse, where there are expected to be some domestic abusers released today as part of this mass release scheme. They are saying that this is not a sufficient move, not enough preparation has been done, and 8 weeks or not, that's not been enough time to prepare for this release.
Well, Charlie Peters, drug dealers, violent cons, prolific car thieves, burglars, domestic abusers, as you said, have been let out today. Sir Keir Starmer says he's uncomfortable at some of the scenes you said there about champagne. But one of the young lags let out, a drug dealer, 6 months out. He said, I'm a lifelong Labour voter now. Charlie Peters, what a time to be alive. Now, around 2,000 prisoners in England and Wales are being freed today early in an attempt to ease the overcrowding crisis in British jails. The offenders, all of whom are serving sentences of less than 5 years, are being released after a mere 40% of their sentence, rather than the usual 50%. And it comes with reports that hundreds of victims were unaware that perpetrators of crimes against them are being freed amid warnings that the public are being put at heightened risk. Well, joining us now is the General Secretary of the Prison Officers Association, Steve Gillan. Steve, welcome to the show. We've seen some incredible scenes outside British prisons today of inmates being released, drug dealers, violent convicts, prolific car thieves, burglars saying, "I'll be back." And we've got the probation officer, Chief Inspector Martin Jones, saying offenders are almost bound to be sent back to jail. What do you make of today's calamitous scenes?
Well, Martin, I think it was inevitable that whoever was the government that was elected in July would have had to make some really difficult choices. I don't think any government, whether it's Conservative or Labour, would want to do this willingly, because as far as I'm concerned, victims should always come first. But our prisons are full. The criminal justice system is collapsing. And the last 14 years of Tory rule has undoubtedly been a total disaster. You know, we've got backlogs in the magistrates' courts of some 300,000 cases. We've got backlogs in the Crown courts of 60,000. So the reality is, for me, and I will always put victims above anything else, quite frankly, but this was inevitable. It was going to happen. The Tories started to release early under previous schemes before the general election, and you know, policies now, they shut 20 prisons from 2010 onwards. I'm afraid you reap what you sow. Well, my union has been saying for a long, long time now, we're heading for a crisis, and we need to have a root and branch review, a royal commission into what it is we want from our criminal justice system and prisons in general.
And Steve Gillan, what do you think that solution would look like? I mean, do we release more people? It's OK to blame the Conservatives for this, but this was a decision taken by the Labour Party to go to 40% rather than 50% of term. But at the same time, Keir Starmer has been jailing people left, right and centre for taking part in riots, even when they've been doing things like posting things on Facebook he doesn't agree with. So there's elements there of two-tier policing, but irrespective of that, how do we sort this mess out? What, do we need to build more NICs?
I don't think you can build your way out of this crisis. I think what we need, Martin, is to have a thorough, urgent debate, one which allows community sentences to be used a lot better to keep petty offenders out of jail and the mentally ill diverted away from prison in the first place. I make no apology for blaming the Conservatives, because austerity measures that they chose to do, robbing effectively the prison service, starving it of money, investment and different things, has partially led to this crisis. I think we lock up more people in this country, in England and Wales, than anywhere else in Europe. I don't think this country is any different to any other country. I don't think it's any worse. But the reality is, and I come to your point about the alleged two-tier policing, no government is ever going to allow the scandalous stuff that we saw on the streets, the rioters, and 70% of them actually had criminal records. They weren't patriots. They were criminalised gangs and individuals that set out to cause disruption. Now, if you cast your mind back to 2011, when we had the same riots in London and across cities breaking out, the Conservatives then had swift justice as well. No government is going to put up with that. So I think to criticise Keir Starmer in relation to that, and if people are stupid enough to put insightful stuff on social media, then they fully deserve what they get, quite frankly.
Well, so that brings me back to my point. It's a question of priorities. We have a certain number of jail places. We're always at capacity. It seems like 84 last week left, 300 left now. My point is simple, Steve Gillan. Should we be sending people to prison for social media posts when today we're letting drug dealers out early, violent convicts out early, prolific car thieves out early, domestic violence charities saying people will be having sleepless nights, not having been told that their abusers could be released out? If it's a question of priorities. Should we really be policing people's tweets and not policing the streets?
Martin, I fully understand where you're coming from, but in relation to who gets locked up is nothing that my union can do about that. That's for the magistrates in the Crown Courts. They're the ones that deliver the sentences, not my union. But I have got a view on it. I think it's long overdue, the discussions. So short term, we support the early release as long as it's properly risk assessed and the individuals that are being released are not a danger to the public. Otherwise, you're absolutely right. They're going to be recalled to prison if they commit further offences. I've got sympathy with the probation officers who haven't been given a long time in order to make sure that people aren't sleeping on park benches and different things. But, that's not unique. That's not just caused by this issue. There are individuals that are released from prison that have no residency to actually go to sometimes. And they do end up on the streets and they do reoffend and they come back in. We've got a revolving door and we need to change the culture in this country, but at the same time protect victims from crime as well.
And Steve, quickly if we could, do you think that risk assessment has been carried out effectively in this situation? Because, as I said earlier, we've got Martin Jones, the Chief Inspector of Probation, saying that his members were told days before that they were having their casework increased, sometimes as many as 70 convicts per probation officer. They were told days before. Normally, he said they're given 3 months. And he said this means that offenders are almost bound to be sent back to jail within days or even weeks. So surely that shows that that risk assessment that you're rightly pointing out hasn't been done.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, quite clearly, he has that information. I don't. My understanding is, yes, it was rushed, but for several weeks now, people have been working on these risk assessment, probation officers and prison staff and different things. Inevitably, and I don't say this lightly, there will be people that reoffend. There's no doubt about that in my mind. But the reality is, this government had to do something. The previous government knew the situation as well. Alex Chalk, who I think was a decent Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State, in meetings I had with him, he knew the situation was dire. The prison system was in crisis. They needed to do something about it. But it was under a Tory government that shut 20 prisons and never built enough spaces to take it on board. So, yeah, I have got a concern, and I'm sure victims of crime, charity groups and others will be watching this situation very carefully. And I've got to say, I'm sure the new Lord Chancellor, Shabana Mahmood, who I've obviously met very quickly as well, and James Timson, the Prisons Minister, they'll be watching very closely to see if there are any reoffending and recalls to prison and different things. So it's all up in the air at the moment. It gives us a little bit of breathing space to prison officers that are overstretched, overworked, by the way, underpaid as well. And my concern is that if this doesn't work, what do we do next? Now, we know next month there's going to be a further release of 2,000 prisoners. It's not ideal, and I said at the very beginning of the interview, I don't think any government in the UK would have wanted to have taken these steps. But the whole system would grind to a halt if they hadn't made these decisions, and I think they've tried to protect the public as best they can as well.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for your time. Superb there.